We can chit chat for just a minute, and then we can jump into it. But thanks everybody for hopping on and joining us. This is obviously a popular topic for just about everybody, AI. But for accountants and bookkeepers, it's particularly interesting because it's got a few different, use cases and plays. Some of them less obvious, at least relative to what's happened with ChatGPT and all of the awareness that that's driven and excitement and stuff like that. But we put out a blog post about a few weeks ago on that front. We had a lot of really good engagement around that. So we were like, maybe we should do a webinar on this. But Brandon, I think, we'll get into this a little deeper, but I think it was interesting, you and I even went back and forth on it. It was like, well, does Uncat do AI? I was like, that's kind of a weird topic because we don't do AI. I was like, well, actually, yeah, it's just a different flavor of AI.
Right. Yeah. It's hard not to do some of it in 2024. And what's funny is Jason and I worked together in a previous company. And so I have literally dozens of podcast episodes out there talking about how the promise of AI was exciting, but it wasn't really happening back then, which arguably was true. And then, like Jason alluded to, everything changed. It's been in the works, right? Sort of it happened slowly and then all at once. But the all at once was the launch of OpenAI's ChatGPT, and everyone saw the power of this thing, and it's continued to iterate since then. And now things seem to be moving really, really quickly. So, and it's an exciting tool. We were just having lunch with a friend who said, I'm changing my workflow so that instead of doing a Google search for something, I'm always starting with AI. I'm always going to ask GPT first. And so that's becoming his go-to. And I think we're seeing that across industries. Obviously, our focus today is on the accounting world for CPAs and bookkeepers, talking about workflow, talking about how AI plays there. But at a high level, at an umbrella level, what we're seeing is it's becoming infused in everything that we do. So I think it's starting for many people to become as commonplace as, oh, I don't know something, I'm going to Google search for it. And many are replacing that with a GPT search or some other AI tool. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, to give everybody an idea of how long you and I have been playing around with this, we actually went out and hired some PhDs out of Oak Ridge National Lab here outside of Knoxville to go work on a AI, machine learning product for our first company we worked on together. And we went and worked on that for a little over a year, never really got very far with it. So like we've been at the head of this, including the missed promise of it for a long, long time now. But it's been interesting seeing it finally get to a place where it's actually delivering on some of those promises. But well, cool. Let's jump into it here. So, what is AI in this space particularly? Like I alluded to, there's a couple of different primary use cases or ways that AI plays relative to the CPA and bookkeeper space, and a lot of them really exciting, both from like the technical execution of the job as well as the management of clientele and practice standpoint on it. And we'll touch on both of those, across this webinar. But let's get started here with just some background information on it. And Brandon, you've been closer to this space than I have here for a few years. So I would love to hear you kind of speak to how you've seen this, changing, especially over the last few years. But 25% of firms are already implemented some form of it. It's supposed to be a 300% growth rate by 2025 in the space. Like these are huge numbers that are driving this within the space in particular. So, what have you kind of seen happen here over the last few years?
Yeah, certainly we see it at the big conferences, right? QuickBooks Connect, Scaling New Heights, XeroCon. There's a big focus on AI. So in all the newsletters and so forth, and you get a lot of leading commentators like Jason Statz, who's been following it really since the inception, who's become a thought leader in the space and is really helping firms to advance AI in their practices. I think the stats here are probably accurate, right? We source these from accurate sources. At the same time, I think they're sort of like the active and passive adoption of AI. So on the one hand, you have firms actively going out and saying, we have this hitch in our workflow, we're trying to solve for it, or we find ourselves constantly getting bogged down these repetitive tasks. There's got to be a better way. Let's try to create some, use AI. Let's try to create some notion of quote unquote robot process automation to try to take some of the pain out of those processes. And at the same time, they're probably passively using a lot of software that's either AI infused or built on an AI platform, right? So whether you're using QuickBooks or Xero or some other general ledger platform, undoubtedly they've implemented some AI in the background, so you're using it whether you know it or not. And that could be something as complex as generative based on the data for a particular client and sort of querying that data through natural language search, which is pretty impressive right now, and that's some of the ways that a lot of us are using it. To something as mundane and that we're all very used to as like, hey, the last time you bought this thing from a vendor, it was for this. Is it for that again? And you could say, well, that might not even be AI. That could just be like they're just looking at the last one and suggesting it. But if they're looking at the last one over the last 5 years and then going by when you tend to buy and how much the transaction was for and so forth, that may be some machine learning happening in the background. It's making a suggestion to you. And then you can say whether the state of the art of that for your clients is good or bad. We've heard feedback both ways. Like, hey, oh, this is pretty great. That saved me some time, to like, why does it keep guessing? It keeps getting it wrong. And we hear that a lot because we see that right from our perch looking at uncategorized transactions, because there's always some mystery around those. And so then the question is, how do you figure those out? Can AI figure it out? Do we need clients to figure it out? And so we do kind of try to keep a finger on the pulse of those questions.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest lessons in embracing or trying to adopt AI is the trust but verify. It's powerful when it does it and when it does it right, but when it can go off the rails, it can go really off the rails. And so you want to make sure that what you're seeing is a repeatable process, is reliable, all of that stuff. And so where you get in trouble is whenever you take it without looking over it and just, hey, we're just going to go with that.
Right. I mean, it's like most any research project going back to when we were in grade school, right? It's a garbage in, garbage out proposition. So a lot of it is contingent on what's the source, right? What data is this based on? And the benefit of some of the larger large language models like an OpenAI, like an Anthropic, et cetera, is it's a lot of data. So it's really looking across a broad swath of data, and so you can get some pretty good answers back. And it keeps getting better. But in the early phase, right, like right after ChatGPT launched, for example, I asked it, hey, let's write a blog post about upcoming tax deadlines. And 80% of the dates it provided were wrong. They weren't bad guesses. They were based on classic tax deadlines of previous years. But it wasn't the tax deadlines this year because there were holidays involved, there were weekends involved, and it hadn't taken that into consideration. It was just going based on the past, whatever, 10, 15, 20 years of tax deadlines, and it hadn't factored in that. So it's like when you go to publish that blog post, you really be publishing dates that were almost all wrong, which is not useful at all, right? I mean, those are hard and fast deadlines from the federal government. You don't want to miss those. And so you do want to review that first. I think it's gotten better. I suspect if we asked it the same question today, it would probably get it right. I didn't test it right before the webinar, so now we'll have to run it and see. But that, to Jason's example, it is helpful to look at it twice to make sure it's based on sound data.
I don't know if you heard it, but I heard a story very early on after the launch of ChatGPT, and it's probably apocryphal, but regardless, it illustrates the point. But a lawyer used ChatGPT to go pull up the case history for a case he was supposed to argue and didn't verify any of it. Like came in, blew away, everybody in the courtroom, stuff like that. Judge went back to go verify and review the case history he cited, and none of it was legitimate. And so,
yeah, that became a pretty famous news headline, right? Because if you looked at the actual conversation that he had with the chatbot, he even said, like, are these real cases? And it responded back, oh, yeah. And it had just basically created these cases really from thin air, but based on other cases, and just created names for plaintiffs and defendants and so forth. And assigned them numbers as if they came from a volume of published cases. And so it looked legit, and it wasn't. That was a huge problem, right? Because it was a legal case. And so it got in the New York Times and all the others. But yes, that would be the sort of one of the pinnacle examples of like, better be really careful with output sometimes.
But to jump into it, this is one of those two sides of the coin that I was talking about, of where AI plays a particular role within CPAs and bookkeepers, and this is on just the data side of it. Like how do you manage, the day-to-day, repeatable task of making sure that, you're, inputting the data correctly, you're categorizing it, that you're identifying where there may be errors or, areas of concern, things to do deeper dive reviews on. A lot of that just menial, repeatable, daily, drudge type actions and activities that you have to do, where the more time that you spend doing that side of it is less time that you have to do the deeper dive analysis on it. Hey, is there something that we're missing, or is there an opportunity to do this better? Is there something we're not taking advantage of? And so obviously being more operationally efficient is a huge advantage, not just from, that's a time suck, not just in the sense that it's consuming a lot of time, but that time it's consuming sort of sucks because you're doing things that are not awesome to do. And then, especially if it can help you do them better, because anytime you're doing repeatable, menial tasks like that, they are prone to errors and just simply messing something up. And so being able to do that both quicker and more accurately carries huge dividends. And I think that's where a lot of the AI, implementations and tools that people are using is on that passive side that you mentioned, Brandon, where a lot of people may not even be aware that they're using AI or that that's even in play there.
Yeah, I mean, I think as with anything, AI included, it's good to start with first principles, which is like, what are computers good at? And it's like looking at lots of data at the same time, which may be very difficult for a human to do. I mean, it's difficult for a human to look across, let's say, 100,000 rows of transactions. Not difficult for a computer to do that. Now with AI, you sort of pair that with, and you can ask it questions and it's trained on similar data, so it can provide some reasonable answers. So, I mean, I think probably what a lot of people on the webinar have already done, and if you haven't already, it's a great place to start. I mean, take an export of a ledger, put it into OpenAI ChatGPT and ask it a question. Hey, are sales up or down this quarter compared to a year ago? Who's our biggest customer? Who's our worst customer? Where are we spending money, right? And you can do some of that inside general ledger software, but even if you're using a really basic general ledger, or if you're keeping books in a spreadsheet or something like that, you can still load it into an AI platform like ChatGPT or another one of your choice, and ask it questions like that. And it's quite good at answering those questions. And it's not, the likelihood of it sort of making up answers on that type of data is pretty low. I mean, it's just going to look and it says, oh, I know what a quarter is. It's 3 months, and I can compare 2024 with 2023, and therefore this is what I found, right? You're 15% up, you're 17% down, whatever it is. So it's really an example of the computer acting like a clock. It's just telling you what time it is, and that's it. Simple questions, simple answers, but it would take a person, a human analyst, maybe a lot more time. You can add layers to that, obviously. Why not load in 5 clients and do it across all 5, and they're in a similar industry? That gets interesting. Now you're talking about a project that a human analyst might take several hours, a day, maybe a week, maybe longer. Maybe they would have trouble even getting started. And that's something that a computer with AI in the background can do very quickly. Similar with error reduction. I mean, it's really hard to find a needle in a haystack when you're looking across tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of data points, relatively fast and easy for computers to do it. So to Jason's point, it's good at doing that. And helping to make decisions. That's one of the interesting things. And for those of you that have experience with ChatGPT, it'll do this for you, right? When you ask it like something about a person, it will usually hedge, right? Like, is so-and-so a good candidate for this job? Like, well, let's look at the resume, let's compare it with the job description, but who knows, right? People are complex, and so you'll probably want to talk with them first. And so the platforms have gotten good at telling you more so than when they first launched about their limitations. So if you were to ask it to make a decision, it will probably talk to you about the risks and benefits. It won't say, stop spending money and close this company immediately because you have a cash flow problem. Instead, it will just say, you have a cash flow problem. It looks like you're 3 weeks away from running out of cash based on your current spend. Here are some possible ideas. You could reduce spend, you could increase revenue, you could take a loan, you could get an investor, right? And it'll sort of weigh those, and you could ask it for its opinion. It may or may not actually give you its opinion if it doesn't have one. It'll just say, hey, these are judgment calls. Those are 4 options. You can mix and match, give it your best shot. But I found value using AI for those types of things, because it may or may not give you a full direct answer. Like it may not solve your problem, but it is a great conversation partner. So it'll start you down a path. You might have thought of like 3 ways to do it, but it might come up with 4 or 5 additional ways that you haven't thought of. And it's really helpful to go on the framework that it shares. It's a great way of thinking through things, I think.
Yeah, no, those are great examples. And then, back to the thing that we, sort of started with is like, does an Uncat even do AI? And then it's like, well, things that are sort of under the surface you may not even recognize, like, optical character recognition, where like, hey, you scan something and it's able to go parse what's in it, or being able to match, receipts that you're submitting, stuff like that. So in particular, with the new receipt module that you guys launched, like all of that stuff is powered by AI in one form, fashion, or another. It's just not the conversational AI that everybody's gotten used to with ChatGPT.
Yeah, so I think, like Jason said, we are using things like optical character recognition and doing a lot of parsing. So for example, my co-founder, Jared, recently built a big receipt processing module in Uncat, right? So you can take one or a dozen or more than a dozen receipts, dump them into Uncat on the web, or send an email with those receipts on them, or have your client text message them into Uncat, no matter what method you use to get them in. We'll then process those receipts. And by process, we mean we'll analyze the receipt, we'll take out the important pieces of information, identify them, like who's the vendor, what was the date, how much was it for, are there multiple lines on this thing, and look for a match in your general ledger, right? It'll look through QuickBooks and say, it looks like it's this one, same date, same amount, same vendor, quacks like a duck, probably a duck, and it will allow you to verify, yep, that's the right transaction, and then you can attach that receipt to that transaction in QuickBooks. If it doesn't exist or we can't find it, we'll tell you if we can find any close matches. Maybe there's a date discrepancy that happens. Maybe it's a slight amount difference. Maybe you bought the same thing twice from the same store back to back. We all do that from time to time. Like, oh, actually, I need another one of those. So then there's 2 transactions. Sometimes if it's not in QuickBooks yet or Xero, then you need to publish it. So we'll say, hey, it's not there yet. Do you want to publish that transaction? You might want to, or you might want to wait for it to reconcile through a bank feed and then attach the receipt from it through Uncat. So it gives you some options. But that process of taking that information out of the receipts is certainly based on obviously some algorithms with machine learning that said, look, we've looked at lots of receipts before. Some of them put the date at the top, some put it at the bottom, some have a subtotal, some separate tax, some don't. We get it. We can look at all those and we can try to figure out who the vendor, the amount, the date, and other key information and do that matching. So that is running. What's been interesting is since the time that we launched, which was almost 5 years ago, looking at the development of AI since then. And so, when we started, people were like, oh, can't the computer just tell what the transaction was for? And our answer was not usually. You spend X number of $100 at Amazon. How should you categorize that transaction? I don't know. Amazon's got 5 or 6 million SKUs. So it could go lots of different places. And you could say, yeah, but I've got the receipt from Amazon. And it's like, okay, that might give you enough information. It might not. I mean, the receipt may just say, you bought these 5 books. And it's like, okay, so it looks like books. How should we categorize it though? Was it books for the sales team? Was it books that were given as a gift to a client? Was it, books that the owner actually bought for his family, but used the wrong credit card? So it ended up showing up on the corporate Amex. All the same 5 books, 3 different categorizations, 3 different tax implications. So even sometimes when you have perfect information about a transaction, the vendor, the date, the amount, exactly what you bought, you still need to find out, in this case, from the client, what was that transaction all about? So Uncat at its core, right, is a communication tool. We still need to have a relationship with the client to understand what that transaction was all about. Okay, so pause. Can AI help us here? And I think the answer is sometimes and maybe, which is a classic lawyer answer. I went to law school a long time ago. Sometimes it can, right? Sometimes it could look at it and say, look, you've been shopping at Amazon for the last 15 years at this given business. Here's where you tend to buy things. When you've bought books in the past, you've almost always categorized it here. Therefore, we would suggest with 87% accuracy, it should end up in this category. Fine. So maybe that helps you. Maybe it saves like a click, maybe 2. You may still need to verify that with a client, especially for a large transaction where not getting it right might have bigger consequences than 5 books, right? Maybe it's 5 refrigerators or 5 big capital assets that you really need to know where they should end up. I mean, frequently in Uncat, we've done several $1 billion of transactions through Uncat. People will put heavy machinery or vehicles in there. It's pretty important you get that $40,000 vehicle categorized properly, and to put that in the right bucket. It might not go into vehicle. It depends on the company and what they got it for, right? And so we can see some benefit of using AI in those situations to do kind of a best guess or a prompt, and probably save you time. So we're looking at ways to bake that in. Meanwhile, at its core, we're a communication tool. And to Jason's point, I'll make this one last point. We can keep advancing, but I think there are some opportunities for us and other applications to continue to build in, less so on the generative side for us, more so on the conversational side. So there's plenty of apps out there that are like, hey, draft me a client engagement letter. It's fantastic. Or you can just go direct to GPT and do it. But some apps have built that in, especially the practice management applications, for example. For us, I think something conversational could have value, right? We have an analytics pane in Uncat where you can see for this client who are the top 5 sources of uncategorized deposits, the top 5 sources of uncategorized expenses, et cetera. But maybe with a bot, you could just ask it, hey, across my entire client base, what vendor accounts for more uncategorized expenses than any other? My guess is it's probably Amazon. If it's not Amazon, it's Target, Costco, Home Depot, Walmart, Lowe's, right? Those big box stores with lots and lots of SKUs. Those tend to be what we see a lot in Uncat. Top sources of uncategorized income, PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, Square, Cash App, right? The money's coming in, or just cold hard cash. Hard to tell what it's for, because not a lot of information comes through on the bank feed for that. So though, being able to ask questions that apps sort of understand across your clients more, what sort of uncategorized transactions you're seeing, we think there's opportunity there. So I would look for some of those things to get baked into Uncat in the not too distant future.
Awesome. So we've already touched on a lot of this stuff, but this is the other side of it. So this is more like the soft skills side of it, and what can you do with it to advance your efficiency and what you're doing relative to a lot of this with actual communication and interacting with your clients. And so that's a lot of the stuff that you just went through there of it of hey, how do you get out in front of, or how do you make them aware of something they may not have been aware of, or specific to some of the stuff you just went through there. Hey, we know you've got a lot of uncategorized transactions, and we know that they're relative specifically to these different vendors. Now let's come up with a suggestion for your clients of what they can do to help alleviate that. Or how do you properly go out and give them a notification or a heads up that that's occurring and they may want to do something about it. And so it allows you to be able to kind of scale up and get more efficient, not just with the ingestion and what you're doing with the data, but also what you're doing with the client interaction side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think these 3 bullet points are great examples. Obviously, sort of the pattern recognition goes to fraud detection. Chatbots for 24/7 support, right? Can it answer simple questions that may be in a frequently asked questions or a knowledge base already? And so you're just making it easier for the client to interact with that knowledge base. Maybe the knowledge base is pretty big now. You don't want them to have to read a 35-page volume about how to get support on a given thing. It'd be easier if they could just ask and get the answer, even if it's at 2 a.m. When staff isn't available. The scalability one, I think, is I mean, those first 2 bullets obviously are important. The scalability one gets really interesting because from the time that we launched Uncat, what we've seen is like, why do firms use Uncat? One, it's to save time. But it's like, okay, what do you do with that additional time? And what we've seen is firms are growing. And so they're using software so that they can open up more time to serve their existing clients better and be more strategic and offer advisory services. B, to add more clients, because there's a lot of demand for their time. So if they're spending a lot of time on manual processes like manually processing receipts, manually pinging the client every 3 days to try to, hey, what was that uncategorized? Here's another spreadsheet. Can you analyze this? Whatever. That's time that they can't use to go get more clients. But more importantly, they have inbound clients wanting to buy their services. They can accept more. And as a result, they can build bigger and more profitable firms. To give a small example, and this is not an example of AI, but AI can certainly enable this type of thing, and more of it is, at Uncat, when clients get notified that they have uncategorized transactions awaiting their answers and attention, we'll send them a notification. We recommend weekly. That's a really good cadence for a client to get into. Monthly is usually too long of a delay, but weekly is about right. And that notification is very specific, right? So it'll say, hey, you've got $9,872.37 of transactions that need your attention. And for a lot of clients, the feedback to their firms has been, that's fantastic. I really appreciate your attention to detail on my books this year. And it's like, well, the bookkeeper accountant is like, well, I'm spending basically the same amount of time on the books as I did the previous year. The quality is the same, the service is the same. But the difference was in that notification, the client is receiving quality service. The client saying, wow, you really must have combed through the books to identify this specific amount of transactions that you had a question about. And I feel like you're really on top of my books. I feel well taken care of as a client. And all of us feel that way, right? When we're getting service from a service provider. So being able to use, in this case, is a notification that we generate. But if using AI, you can generate additional insights that are like that, right? So it doesn't have to be in a quarterly reporting packet. It could just be on a random Wednesday morning. Hey, we noticed something in the books, and it's a very specific. Maybe we don't even know what it's all about, but we just thought we'd highlight it to you because we pay attention to stuff like this. And the client can say, oh yeah, it's no big deal. That was just sort of an anomalous purchase. We needed to do it. Emergency, fix the leak, whatever. Or they could say, what the heck is that? I had no idea my team was spending money on that sort of stuff, right? And it could be like, hey, thanks for flagging that and not waiting until tax time or the end of the quarter or the end of the year. Thanks for getting it now so we can nab it and not incur maybe a subscription cost that sort of goes on over time and everyone forgets to cancel it. So I think that AI can be super useful for firms for basically communicating with clients and sharing little small insights with them that add inordinate value.
Yeah, I mean, I think at heart what you're talking about there is, the additional value add that gives you a competitive leg up. The ingestion of the data, the matching of records, the keeping the books clean, all of that stuff is table stakes. Like you've got to do it or you're not going to retain your clients, period. But at heart and part of, by definition, it's what everybody has to do. So it doesn't set you apart. It's the ability to be able to do additional value add, pull additional insights, spend additional time and attention with your clients. All of those things are where you're able to grow, your both the number of clients that you have, but also what you do with them. So like you alluded to, that can be, additional services, that could be, doing additional advisory type roles, it could be adding net new clients to it. It can, a big piece of it is just simply retaining your clients and not having them churn and go find net new ones, because talk about the most inefficient part of your business process. It's the going and finding and bringing on net new clients. And so even if you're doing nothing more than just making them feel more warm and fuzzy, so they stick around, like that's enormous value for you internally, because let's face it, this is a space in an industry where you're providing a technical service that requires trust. And so don't undercount how important that warm and fuzzy stuff is, because if they don't trust you, they're not going to stick with you.
Right.
Awesome. So, at a high level, like all of this stuff can net you upwards of 10 plus hours a month in savings and efficiency. And so that's kind of where we were, talking through this is, all right, what can you do with that additional time in your pocket that's going to be able to help you be, more efficient, more profitable, and be able to scale what you're doing. And so, the types of tasks that are really driving that time savings, it's the manual data entry, it's the processing of things, it's the having to go out and communicate with your clients around things like unmatched or uncategorized transactions. Being able to detect stuff ahead of time proactively that where there may be errors or fraud or whatever. Like these are all very time consuming things that you've got to do. And they're all things that are tied to that table stakes piece of it. Like if you don't do these things, then you're not, at the most fundamental level doing what you were hired to do. And so if you can automate some of the stuff or get it more efficient, then that's what frees up time. And allows you to start asking these questions. Okay, what can we do with that?
Yep, I think we covered most of that one. I don't have a lot to add to that one. I think those are all
I'll touch really quickly. I think
bullets.
This applies to both you and me, Brandon. Work-life balance is one of those do as we say, not as we do. Brandon and I are particularly bad about that one. Do prioritize that. Try not to make that optional because, yeah, for the most part, it's worth investing in that and making that a priority for yourself. And it is actually something that pays long-term dividends to your ability to be able to operate in a sustainable manner and provide the level of service and attention that's desired. I think there's probably something fundamentally wrong with entrepreneurs like us, Brandon. So definitely do what we say in that
All the
capacity,
good
not as we
things,
do.
all the good things.
Okay, so what are some things above and beyond like adopting tech that's going to be able to allow you to automate and get more efficient with a lot of these repetitive tasks and be able to save you some time? And we already touched on some of these, but we'll go into some details. And what part of what we'll share afterwards also are some recommended prompts that you guys can try with something like ChatGPT and go see what you can put into practice and put to work on this stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of variety of ways that you can try and use this and things you can do with it. At the most basic level is, instead of Googling, and now that we're at a place where it's actually fairly reliable in the querying of, basic questions like what are, deadlines and stuff like that coming up, it can be a very effective way to go and pull that type of information. But you can also do, even some more advanced, but certainly tier one type analytics and analysis of data within it. But you already touched on some of these, but any in particular that you've seen that have been particularly interesting or effective, Brandon?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all good examples of examples, right? I mean, it's the tip of the iceberg. So I think it goes back to the beginning, and we were talking with our good friend James earlier, and he just said, look, by default, I'm starting to just try asking GPT for anything I have a question about. And so I think it's reasonable to sort of like, it's not a long pause, but it's just a quick pause of like, oh, I need to send that report to the client. Maybe I could use GPT for that. Oh, I need to check this for anomalies before I make this filing. Maybe I could use a tool to do that for me, right? And we all got used to that to the point that we don't really talk about it anymore, where it's like, if we don't know something or we need a little piece of information, we Google it, right? It became a verb. As soon as it launched, it was like, wow, this is really good. It finds the top result like all the time. Fantastic. And we've all been using it for the last 20 plus years. And so now with AI, it's sort of like, well, you're not going to ask Google, hey, can you analyze these transactions? There's no like method for doing that through that interface, but there is through ChatGPT and other LLM platforms. So, the question is, hey, can I quickly upload a file and then get an answer back for things like generating a forecast or analyzing transactions or summarizing? Jason and I talked earlier, he had done a summary of like a 35-page memo, except that memo was in fact coming from a half dozen different documents, right? So it was like, first, take these half dozen different documents and combine them. And then second, I have some questions about that combined document. Let's look for trends of commonalities, differences among those documents, and then let's create a summary. And for most of us, that's a multi-hour project, even if you're really good at that sort of stuff. So it's like, that's the sort of stuff that a lawyer would have to do, right? Here's a ton of content. Make sense of this, create a story around this case. Can AI help with that? Yeah, it sure can, because it can parse that information way faster. Just because it's not going to have to look through each of the 35 pages, it just sort of instantly assumes that knowledge and then can query it in clever ways. So I think, for me, I want to do as James suggested, which is start using it more. Because the cost of it not getting it exactly right is very low. I mean, you can always say, summarize key changes, especially for one that you've already done, and then see if it says the same stuff you said. And if it gets some additional things, great, incorporate the added stuff. If it totally messes it up, maybe it's not ready, or maybe you didn't feed it all the data that it needed to create it. If it does a better job than you did, great, you just found a new tool that can replace some of the time that you took to create your summary in the first place. So, there's a way to A/B test some of this stuff by going back in time to reports that you've already sent, summaries you've already sent, advice you've already given to your clients, and see what AI says. And if it's in alignment with the types of advice that you give, the types of reports that you provide, then fantastic. It's probably going to save you a ton of time.
Yeah, a couple of quick asides on that front. One of the things I struggled with and just starting to get better about is that piece that James had recommended. Like, hey, most of the time that you're going and Googling something, like, probably be better off going and asking a GPT about it. And so I actually took the where I had like Google on my phone or on my desktop, launch bar, whatever, and swapped out where Google was with ChatGPT. So, it's just trying to change behavior. And so, and just naturally muscle memory go to that place. And it's like, okay, now there's something else there. And it's forced me to start looking at things. A perfect example of like where I use that, and I probably wouldn't have done it if that prompt hadn't been there for me, was, you and I, Brandon, were trying to figure out, hey, what's happened to demos that you were doing for people with Uncat? And we were like, we don't know how many of those are happening on like a monthly basis, whatever. And so you went into Calendly and exported that. And like normally I would have had to have opened that up in Excel and then go and pull some formulas on it and summaries and stuff like that. Instead, I just dropped it in ChatGPT. I was like, all right, give me the total per month that
Right.
demos that have been booked. And then this is one I stumbled upon, and I was showing you earlier today, and it was part of that, where I had just a ton of documentation, a ton of data from this client, and I've started doing it as an offshoot of that. If you start dropping everything that you have relative to a client into a single GPT chat, then you're actually training a model around all of the context, all of the detail, all of the nuance that you accumulate over time around this client. And so, especially over that a longer time horizon, especially with more and more data and stuff that's being put in your hands relative to it, that going and just surfacing that, oh hey, where was that? Hey, oh hey, that's across 4 different spreadsheets. Now I got to go try and pull that together, whatever. Like you now have all of that in a centralized place that's queryable. That is insanely powerful. Whenever you're just trying to simply keep your arms around all of the information, all of the things that you have been given or handed with that client. And so doing nothing more than making sure all of that stuff is just simply dropped into a GPT and a model that you have around that is insanely powerful. Just to be able to go do nothing more than surface it, much less manipulate that data or anything like that with it. All right. And actually, this is perfect because this is exactly the type of thing that gets more powerful and better whenever you have that amount of context and data in there, because it's garbage in, garbage out. And the more information you have, the more accurate and reliable the prompts or the returns that you get off your prompts are going to be. And so, asking it to help you create, things like a client communication template, or define the specific thing in the data or whatever, the more background, the more context, the more data that it has around that, the better it's going to be at that. And so, just simply taking everything that you have that is a valuable piece of information from a client, dropping it in there, makes it that much easier to ask these types of things.
Yeah, the other thing I'll quickly add, and we probably have some examples of this, but and many of you obviously have used ChatGPT before, but one of the things that I think is really interesting is its ability to adopt a persona of your choice, right? So you can say, create a client communication template for a common issue. You could also preface that with, you're a seasoned CPA with 25 years of experience, and your firm is best known for expertise in oil and gas. Create a client communication template for, right? And GPT will assume that persona, right? So now it's a seasoned CPA that works in an oil and gas consultancy and works in client advisory services. And so that's really interesting to think about, basically creating a persona for yourself, right? If you want it to represent you, your firm, kind of what you're about. You can also add a tone to it, right? So like highly professional business tone versus hey, in a conversational tone, create or in a fun-loving tone, right? Or a tongue-in-cheek, like depending on the type of relationship you have with your clients, the type of persona that you want to have personally, that you want to have with your firm, you can have it right in that style. So you can think about tone, you can think about style, you can think about its persona, right? It's taking on the persona of a person of your description, and have it write answers in that way. Because early on, like when I used it and I didn't know to do that, I'd have it write things, but then I was always like, I'm gonna have to rewrite that because this doesn't really sound like something I would write. But if you create a persona for it, it's going to get closer to maybe what you want it to sound like. I mean, anything like letter length, I'm always going to rewrite it a bit because it doesn't necessarily come off quite right. To me, it still sounds computer-ish if I just used it verbatim. But by creating a persona, it gets much closer. There's a lot less editing for me to do if I remember to do that.
And on the flip side of it, I mean, one of the things we talked about, okay, you've got, 10 plus hours extra a month now. If you've implemented these things, like what can you do with it? And, things we talked about for going and growing your business, growing your revenue would be, potentially adding on additional types of services or offerings that you have. Oftentimes, if you want to do that, you need to start specializing. And as somebody that's started and run a couple of agencies now, it's one of the lessons I learned very hard the first go around, which is if you don't specialize to some degree with what you're doing, like you wind up having to go create the wheel every single time. You're not going to be very efficient with it. And so when I talk to others that are facing or trying to wrestle with that same challenge, a lot of times what I get is pushback or question is, okay, what should I specialize in? My answer is almost always the same. Like, what is a commonality across all of these clients that you have? Or what do you do particularly well? Or what's something that's a repeatable process? Well, guess what? This is exactly the type of thing that you could even feed into ChatGPT and say, okay, here are all of my clients that I've had over the last 3 years. Analyze what categories these are in, and then figure out of that what are common needs or areas that they need, additional help or expertise. That would be additional things that I can offer to them. And so it allows you to be able to come at it from like an actual data centric, hey, these are commonalities across what I've done and what I've been doing, that would naturally lend themselves or feed into going and doing and offering X, Y, or Z. And so a lot of times, just figuring out where to even begin, and trying to build out additional things or offerings is the most difficult part of it. And you're always going to be better off going and looking at, okay, who do I actually work with, or who have I worked with in the past? And what are some of the missed opportunities potentially there that I could have gone and done additional things as value add for them? All right. Additional things. Let's ask some of you guys. I'm sure a lot of you have had some opportunities to play around with. Maybe some of you have even been prompting as we've been going along to see what you might spit out of it. But what are some of the things that you've either worked with or you would like to try? I'd love to see you guys pop some stuff into the chat here, and let's see what we get out of that. While we do that, we can take a look at, so let's have some people drop that in if you can into the chat, the side panel here. While we let you guys drop some things in there, hopefully, we can talk about where it's going to go next. Where do we see it? And so, I think really big within this one for me is really on the data analytics side of it, like the ability to be able to do, deeper dives in it, especially around like predictive analytics is going to be huge across the board, but especially in this space. In addition to this kind of softer skill sides of things, the advisory pieces of it. So less and less time is going to be spent on just that table stake stuff. And it's going to really elevate, those people that provide that additional value add, guidance, type, leadership type roles within this. It's going to elevate them to an additional level within it, where they're really going to be looking for strategic guidance and assistance on that side, as opposed to just simply being able to, reconcile books. Brandon, where do you see some of the big areas that are going to really change here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that just in the last few weeks, at least that I've become aware of, so I might have predated that, but I think the announcement was in the last few weeks of being able to actually install a desktop agent that is essentially watching everything you do and how you work. And it can start to learn not only from the content that you're interacting with, but also the process you use to interact with that content. So then you'll be able to ask it questions about the things that you've been working on, like, hey, yesterday I was, trying to edit this thing. I was also searching for answers online and so forth. What do you suggest I do? And it's like, yeah, I was there watching that, right, the whole time. So it's like, okay, is potentially that like, yeah, I don't know if I want it watching the whole way. Maybe not though, right? I mean, we've all become pretty accustomed to deciding when we want to trade, maybe some privacy to the extent that working on a report for a customer or a client is it needs to be a private activity. The data is private, certainly. So in any of these examples, right, you're going to want to give some thought to where is this data going? How is it protected, right? Know the terms is important, but the convenience of it being able to learn from your process without you having to even describe your process or document it and having it be able to help you with that, I think is one of the things that's starting to happen now. I think is pretty exciting for all of us because I suspect it will be able to help us do things that we're asking it to help do. I suspect it'll probably learn to say like, hey, I think I can help you with that. It looks like you're really struggling, right, to find this answer. I know the answer to this one. I go ahead and raise my hand and sort of step in. And so we're getting pretty close to that point, which is great. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the near term stuff. Some of the far beyond stuff we'll leave to more of the futurists and the folks that are envisioning this and building it. But to me, I think that's a pretty big development because it means that we're not a very big leap away from you being able to say like, listen, we've got this employee down sick, but you've been watching that employee work every day for the last year. So maybe you can just kind of keep doing that today and kind of hold down the fort while they're out. And, I think that then AI, even without being sort of uniquely trained on their emails or uniquely trained on how they send reports or whatever, would be able to handle that. I don't know that we would give it the keys today, but I think as it continues to learn, we're not that far away from it being like, hey, Brandon's out today. Do Brandon's job today. Probably consist of like, all right, I'm going to respond to those emails in a timely manner. I'm going to send those reports, which he seems to do weekly or monthly, to those particular clients. Okay, I can do that. Do some research on some things, process some categorize, right? Like it can do those things, doing some more of the human connection one-on-one, have a conversation with someone and sort of connect in a way that AI is unlikely to connect, right? So sort of like, oh, wow, you went to that school. I have a buddy that went to that school. Like AI is not going to say that because that's not an experience that it's had. And that's the way that oftentimes we create relationships. That's how deals get done. That's how we forge trust and bonds with other people. So I don't think we're close to that. But to just sort of knock out the day-to-day work, yeah, it's coming, not just to accounting as an industry, it's coming to across industries.
Yep. Jennifer, thank you for giving us heads up. It looks like the chat is disabled, but Q&A is open. So
Okay.
if you guys wanted to share any prompts or use cases, anything like that in Q&A instead of chat, apologies, not sure why that was disabled there, but it looks like the Q&A does work and is open on that side. But yeah, it's interesting. We prompt AI as the primary way of interfacing and stuff like that. But yeah, I've actually started having it prompt me in return. The primary one being that client use case that we were talking about, where I fed it all of this data and context around them, and it started prompting me like, "Hey, you may want to ask me about this deep dive aspect of their technology, or how people are playing with this use case and stuff." And so that was fascinating because I didn't even know it could do that. And two, it was like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. The types of things that it's encouraging me or prompting me to ask it out of it. Cool. So we've got somebody asking, besides ChatGPT, what other AI tools do you recommend accountants to check out? Brandon, any specific with you? I know across a lot of the AI tools out there, each one has sort of its little idiosyncrasies and things that it does better or well versus another one. For instance, Google's solutions are much better at like sort of real time, querying of the web and stuff like that, as you might expect. Versus, something like ChatGPT is going to be typically a little bit more dated with its information and stuff like that. But what about you?
Yeah, I mean, there's almost too many to list at this point. Some that are popular and that have big backing, right? So big teams and they're developing fast. You could try some of the conversational and generative apps like Claude. That one's popular. If you're talking about images, I mean, so far all of this has really revolved around client communication, client interaction, reporting, workflow. But if you're like, hey, I need to create a really compelling presentation, or I want to create some really novel new artwork for my website, or for the next time I go to a conference, then looking at OpenAI's DALL-E or Midjourney, or even using some of the AI tools in Canva. And I'm sure AI is now embedded in lots of your favorite tools, including Adobe tools that you may use on your desktop or online. So thinking about AI, not just in terms of generative and text-based conversational queries, but also in terms of its ability to create novel images, videos, right? There's some really great tools for AI and video. We can probably circulate some links following the webinar, or of course you can always look them up. But yeah, it's worth considering as you're thinking about AI. Obviously, OpenAI has created the most buzz and has big backing from Microsoft, and they're using it in Copilot across the Office suite. Meanwhile, Google has Gemini. You can find that in most of its web-based tools, as well as in Google mobile apps and most of the Google properties online. So yeah, thankfully we've got some options, but most of us are probably going to lead with ChatGPT, because it sort of set the initial line in the sand of like, it's arrived and it's different now than it was before. And so I tend to start there, but there's some other great tools out there. So depending on what you're trying to solve for, whether it's an image or a video or text search or generating a report, then you may be able to find sort of a custom service that specializes in that. And I think that's what we're seeing. There's going to be the big players that sort of own the overall space, have the largest data sets. They're extremely expensive. They're very power intensive. They require massive processors and data centers to do it. And then with that foundation, there's going to be a lot of firms that specialize in very specific things. Like, hey, we help you securely back up your data warehouse and then query it using OpenAI, but we handle the service part of it, making sure the data is secure. It's like, oh, great, use that firm to do that. Obviously, Intuit has announced a lot of its AI initiative. There's some baked in to QuickBooks Online already. No doubt, Xero and FreshBooks and all the other major general ledgers out there, NetSuite, et cetera, are along the same path. So anyway, there's a few quick ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, Kenneth had a great question of, how do you stay updated on all of this development? I'm here to tell you, like, even as somebody who's a huge geek and has spent my entire career in tech, and has been an early adopter in just about everything, including AI, like the pace of change is impossible to keep up with. Holy crap. Like I've never seen something move as quickly as this. And so then it raises the question, like, where do you go? Frankly, I think the best place to go for it are forums and communities where people are, out there trying, testing, playing around with stuff, because it's not just the development on the tech side of it, but it's the development on how people are, innovating how we interact and utilize this tech and the capabilities with it. And so, it's two sides of the equation. It's not just what, has been, created or updated from a, tech stack or a feature standpoint, but it's also how are people going and putting that to work and to use. And so the places that are going to be typically most effective for staying on top of it are places where, people at the leading edge of implementation and utilization of this tech are talking about it or highlighting what they're doing and stuff like that. And, perfect example of it, arguably one of the, advances or new features rolled out recently that I've got most excited about is relative to DALL-E that you mentioned, Brandon, on the generation of images and stuff. Anybody that's played around with it knows how hit or miss it can be. And so, you can tell it what you want and stuff like that, and it'll more often than not generate something that's remarkably close to what you had in mind. But where it gets really, really infuriating is whenever it's so close and you just need like this one little thing tweaked, and you try and tell it, hey, I want you to leave everything the same except change this. And you get a completely new image more often than not, with it not having fixed or changed that one thing that you wanted it to change. And so DALL-E had a release a couple of weeks ago where it actually allows you to be able to go in and highlight and specify a specific piece of that image that it created and say, I want you to change this. And so it's giving you the ability to, go and fine tune what it's creating, which had been missing until just a couple of weeks ago. But, those types of huge changes within what it does are coming out all the time, and they fundamentally shift how you use it whenever those types of things are released. Because up until then, it was sort of a crapshoot. It was image generation roulette. Is it going to get what I wanted it to do and it be right or not? And there wasn't a whole lot of fine tuning that could be done with it. And so, the best way to kind of stay on top of both sides of that equation, innovative ways people are putting it to work, as well as the net new features and innovations coming out from it, is really to go and find the communities, the spaces where people are engaging and talking about it. And guess what a great way is to go find those? You can go prompt and ask ChatGPT or whatever your preferred one is. Hey, where are some public forums, communities, LinkedIn groups, Facebook groups, whatever, where people are talking about this? And they can oftentimes give you some good direction on where to go and try and plug in on that front.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, right? Because I usually try to use AI from a text format to get me down the road. Like if it can do 80%, I'm like pretty happy about it. It's like, great, that just saved me the blank page issue, right? It was like hard to get started and it gets me 80% of the way down the road and then I can edit it and ship it. If it gets me farther than that, then I'm really, really excited. For an image, yeah, you make it really close, but it's like, oh, it's not quite right. So it's unusable. And then the question is, now what? And it's like, well, you can tell it try again, right? You can say try again from scratch, or you could say, hey, use that last image, except let's soften the red. Or, hey, can you get rid of, the extraneous hand? Like we only want the character to have two hands, you put three in, that's super weird. And same for video, but it can also be helpful to like, okay, maybe it gets at 90% there, but you already know a talented designer. And rather than have them do a week-long project of designing something from scratch, you can send them something and say, this is basically what I want. I just think the background is a little weird, for what we're trying to do in this report. Can you edit that? And hopefully it's a small project. You could even post it online to like a freelancer and have them do it. So I think it's a good way. If it doesn't get production ready, at least it gets you down the path.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. We're already toward the end. We're
Yep. We got
what do they say on
minute
TV?
left.
Hit them with the promo.
Well, one say before we hit with the promo, this is a really funny aside. I was using DALL-E to generate icons for my wife's med spa for the website listing, and I had one of the treatments I was trying to generate it for, and it was determined it was going to have somebody's butt crack in it. And I tried to say, I was like, okay, whatever you do, like I want it from the waist up. And it was like as much direction as I gave it, it didn't matter what I told it. It was still going to have that image with the butt crack poking out of the sheet or whatever it was that was covering it up. And it finally just gave up on it. But it was like no amount of specificity, anything like that, was going to get it to generate what I wanted it to generate there. You can see why I was so excited by that release on Dolly. I was like, yes, because as I told Brandon when he hired me the first time, I was like, if you have me doing design or coding a website, you've got me doing the wrong things. So I'm definitely not a designer. But cool. This has been great, guys. Great conversation. Thanks everybody for chiming in with questions, feedback on it, stuff like that. Like I said, Uncat's doing some cool things with the AI side of things, as well as really trying to lean in and help you guys become more efficient and level up what you're doing from just a business standpoint. And so we love to be able to provide tips and stuff like that. A lot of those based around AI on how to level up your offerings and engagement with your client base. So thanks everybody for joining. Like you see here on the slide. If you guys want to, give Uncat a trial and you haven't before, we'll kick you over a $5 Starbucks gift card for anybody that comes and does that. And then we'll send out a piece of collateral that's got a bunch of sample prompts that you guys may want to try. And then, of course, hit us up if you have questions, any follow-ups, anything like that. We love to be a resource and help out.
Yeah, appreciate y'all joining us today. And it's a great last point Jason made. He'll share some sample prompts, which it's always great to start with a template. And then it's also a great sort of ending point, which is to say, there's lots of people using AI now. So anytime you're thinking about possibly writing a query, you can also search for prompts related to that and go swipe people's prompts. They post them, they're trying to be helpful. It's just like posting sample Google searches, but instead it's like, hey, I've used this prompt and it's really helpful for my accounting firm. And it's like, great, grab that prompt and adapt it for your own use. And so I actually think that's a great sort of entree to getting into it, just finding prompts and trying them out on your own data for your own purposes. So Anyway, thanks, Jason. Always great to do it with you. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll shoot you up a follow-up email.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.